So we are right here. Chad just did an excellent job giving you all an overview of the fisheries aspects as well as some of the big picture water quality concerns. I'm going to talk about the watershed plan that we've been working on and will be wrapping up going forward. One of the main things we want to get out of tonight is questions and input from you, because the way that plan looks and feels and reads does need to be driven in part by those that are using the lake and those that are working and living in the watershed and own the land on the watershed. So we want to get that input, and we do have time at the end of the presentation to make sure we do that. So not just asking questions, but also kind of being our eyes and ears out there in the lake and the watershed. So the plan, this agenda is specific to the plan. It really lays out, much like the table of contents in that plan. I won't get really deep into the weeds. Chad and Tyler did a really good job of covering some of this, but we'll talk about the purposes and the goals of the plan and how it relates to what these gentlemen already discussed. I want to just provide an overview of the watershed and the lake from maybe a little bit different perspective than the fisheries perspective, and then talk about what's happening out there in the watershed and what some strategies or some alternatives are to help us get to where we want to be, not only to improve but to protect the lake for the long haul. And then we'll get into some of your questions and feedback. So the purposes and the goals of this plan, there are really four major purposes. Number one, it does need to satisfy 9 elements that are required by EPA, because it is EPA money that is funding this effort. And that's really important in order to make the plan and the things in the plan eligible for future funding. So we got to cover that. We want it to be watershed and lake community driven, which is why we're here tonight. We want this plan to make sure that it quantifies the problems, the pollutant sources, and also sets a target. Where do we need to get to meet water quality objectives, both now and going forward? And then we want to lay out an implementation plan that gives us kind of a map to where we want to go. What's it going to take to be successful? How fast can we get there? And of course, what is it going to cost to get there? And then again, we want to connect the dots to that cost with these different funding programs that are available to us. The watershed is primarily row crop agricultural, much like much of Iowa. 4,600 acres, I think Chris mentioned that earlier. We've got a 150 acre plus lake. That ratio is about 30 to 1. What that means is for every 1 acre of lake area, you've got 30 acres of land that drains to the lake. That's what the watershed is. So very interesting topography in this watershed. You're all very familiar with it, obviously, but that flat tabletop kind of plateau on the northern end, and then once it starts to make its way, water makes its way down into the stream channels, it drops pretty rapidly. We've got some steep slopes, particularly around the lake itself and the gullies and the tributaries and streams that dump into the lake. So that creates some hot spots for erosion, of course. Chad mentioned the lake very deep relative to a lot of Iowa lakes, which is good, but we have seen in recent years, this is a contour map of the lake. This is actually available online too for you anglers that might find that interesting. We are starting to see that upper end of the lake fill in with sediment quite significantly compared to pre-construction, pre-project conditions. Chad mentioned this. When we talk about water quality, we're really talking in most cases, particularly for lakes, about water clarity. How clear is the water? Too much nutrients, as Chad mentioned, just like in your yard, nutrients do a great job of growing grass, or in a cornfield growing corn. In the lake, plants like nutrients as well. It's a little bit of too much of a good thing. Some nutrients and productivity aren't bad, but too much can make that water really green, and you can't see as far down in the water, which affects recreation, certainly affects the fishery as well, as Chad noted. The other issue you can get into is that chocolate melt color that happens after a rainfall, probably a little bit that way right now if you were to walk down there, making it a brown color. That's from sediment and fine clay material that comes into the lake with rainfall runoff. It takes a long time for those particles to settle. That creates that brown condition. And you'll typically see a lake kind of oscillate back and forth from brown to green depending on weather. This is a little bit complicated here, but the two colors here, I'll walk you through this. That blue color there coming down from the top, that is a measure we call Sepi Depth. And all that is a measure of how far down, pretend this is the surface of the water, how far down can we see into the lake. And these represent 3 samples done every year. Notice the very clear trend here. That spring sample, you're seeing a long ways down into the lake. That indicates good water clarity. The water's clear, it's transparent, you can see a long ways down. During the growing season, of course, things heat up. We get some rainfall in the spring, washes some fresh nutrients in. That clarity starts to diminish significantly throughout the year. One culprit or one cause is what you see in the green, which is a measure of the pigment in algae. So as the algae start to grow and thrive later in the year, it reduces that water clarity. So pretty clear evidence as to what's causing the clarity problems in Big Hollow. From a regulatory standpoint, or maybe from an EPA perspective, they're really concerned with the impairment status. Impairment just simply means that the lake is not fully supporting all of the potential uses for that lake. The culprits here in Big Hollow are algal growth and also pH, but they're very much related. That pH swings right along with algal productivity. What you see on this chart is called trophic state. Again, a technical term, don't get too hung up on that. The higher up in this graph, the more productive the lake is. Whether you're measuring that productivity in terms of phosphorus, which is the green triangles, or clarity, which is the blue squares there. Anything in this box is higher than we'd like to see it from a water quality standards standpoint. So the whole purpose of this project would be to try to, fast forward 5-10 years from now, we see points down towards the bottom of this box, or preferably even lower than that box. One last data trend I'll show here is looking back into time. This orange dashed line here is total phosphorus concentration measured in the lake. And you see that it has been going up in recent years. It is interesting that the annual average algae chlorophyll A concentrations have actually been going down, but there's a lot of nuance to that. Anytime we see the nutrient go up, we want to make sure we address that, because eventually that green line is going to start to head the other way on us here. So we still are over that standard on overall, but that's the trends here. The pollutant source assessment. Tyler mentioned this earlier tonight. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources is tasked by EPA to write what they call a total maximum daily load for any water body that is impaired. We just kind of talked about why Big Hollow is impaired, and so that triggered the DNR to have to write this plan that identifies what's causing that impairment. In this case, it's phosphorus, sediment as well, but primarily phosphorus. They had to estimate how much phosphorus was coming in annually to the lake, and then develop a goal or a target. So that work was already largely been done. This actually just wrapped up around the first of the year, so maybe January, February. There was a public meeting online, a virtual meeting. Some of you may have had the opportunity to listen to that. But long story short here, the existing load of phosphorus coming into the lake is about 6,700 to 6,800 pounds of phosphorus per year. And we want to get that down to more like 26 or 2,700, about a 60% reduction is the target here. That might sound like a lot, but it's really not. Chad and I both have seen lakes in much worse shape than this. This is actually quite doable. It will take some time to get there, but definitely optimistic. The TMDL that was developed at DNR also specifies how much of that load is coming from the various sources in the watershed, which is important for planning how we're going to address the issues. So how are we going to do that? What are some alternatives and strategies? And again, we definitely want to hear, particularly from the landowners here, what sort of conservation strategies or methods are most appealing to you. We want to hear about what their barriers to adoption are. We want to work with you, these funding programs, to help put the right package of conservation alternatives together here for Big Hollow Lake. We follow the Nrcs paradigm conservation pyramid, if you will. Our first and best option always is to really try to keep nutrients in place where they're most useful, which is in the field and not in the water. So we do that through building soil health with things like cover crop, reduced tillage, and Tyler could probably speak to you for hours and hours on those kinds of practices. So if you've got an interest there, make sure you hit up Tyler before you leave tonight. So we want to avoid losses at the source where we can. Erosion and nutrient transport is to some extent a very natural thing. We can't reduce it to zero. It is going to happen. So when it does happen, how can we control it? How can we trap and treat and intercept that material that begins to move before it gets to surface water, specifically before it gets to the lake. So that includes things like grass waterways, sediment control basins, things of that nature. And then as you move up the pyramid, you're kind of getting closer and closer to the lake. You're moving through lines of defense, if you will. And the last thing you see here is some of the sediment ponds at the park, or maybe a large forebay in the upper end of the lake. That's a potential option in some cases, where you're really mitigating what's already been done. That can include things like shoreline work and dredging as well in some cases, where you've got some legacy things that have entered the lake. How do you deal with that? Then you're really up here at the top, where you're dealing with what's been done in the past and how do we address that. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with conservation practices that are available through these programs, things like cover crops, again, I think I mentioned that, buffer strips along streams, sediment and water control basins, conservation tillage, waterways, grass waterways, very important. And another piece of work that some of the project partners have put together is using a software program. I won't bother you with the acronym, you've had enough of those tonight already. But what it does is it looks at the soils and the slopes and other characteristics about the watershed, and it kind of tells you where things are best fit in the landscape. So where's a good spot for a terrace, or a grass waterway, or a sediment control basin. So we have that information. It is in what we call a GIS format. That just simply means it's digitized and available to us. And some of the modeling that we do to come up with those pollutant loads and pollutant targets are heavily based on that information. I know you can't see the tables there in the back of the room. That's okay. This is really more to illustrate the process that we go through in developing the plan, so don't get too hung up on the numbers. They're a little bit preliminary anyway, but because of that TMDL that's been done already, what we have now is we have, for sediment and phosphorus, those are the two most concerning pollutants for Big Hollow, we have smaller watersheds, smaller drainage areas within the overall drainage area called sub-basins or sub-watersheds. We know about how much of the sediment and phosphorus is coming from each one of those areas. We also know, because of the conservation planning work that's been done, we know about how many acres we could potentially treat with the different practices. We didn't go through and look at specific parcels and say this place has to have a terrace. That's not how this works. This is voluntary. But what this means is these acres here, that these could be potentially treated by these practices, because we know these practices, at least based on the characteristics of the landscape, work in these areas. So this is kind of our maximum conservation potential here. So we look at that. And then we look at the different practices that are at our disposal. Again, grass waterways, sediment control basins, buffer strips, cover crops, anything like that and more. We look at what they're typically able to do in terms of their performance at reducing the transport of sediment and nutrients. We take those three sets of information and we come up with some potential adoption rates by practice. Again, this is where we kind of need some input from landowners, is what practices might work for you, where if you had success in the past, where if you had difficulties or barriers getting things adopted. But we need to come up with a plan for about how many acres we think we can treat with these different practices in order to get to that goal of how many total pounds of phosphorus we need to reduce into the lake. So again, just an example only. The last step here will be, this is where we're going. We want to get to that TMDL target of about a 60% reduction. The last step will be putting numbers to that, both in terms of not just cost, but also schedule. What is a reasonable rate of adoption of the various practices? What parts of the watershed might be more suitable than others for different types of practices, and lay out a plan to show how we can get to that water quality goal for EPA and for other funding agencies, so that they will step up to the plate here and help us get some of these practices in the ground. So that's where we're going. Just a real quick note about kind of where we are. I mentioned those required elements. The plan has to include these 9 things. We've got about 5 of them done already, and a good start on the other 4. And so this is where we'll be going in the future. We want to line up the technical and financial assistance needed. Make sure that people have the information through the surveys and the online information that Chris and his team have put out there. Tonight's a big part of that as well. And we want to develop a project schedule that includes those measurable goals and milestones. I mentioned the public feedback, and Chris, you jump in any time here if there's anything else you want to add to this. So this is available online. Chris said he's going to leave it up. If you're not sure how to get to that information, make sure you talk to Chris before you leave tonight, and he'll point you to that link. And we can even throw it up here later. But just some of the preliminary feedback that we have received that we thought were interesting results. One question, this was posed to the public at large or any stakeholder. The question was, how often do you normally visit Big Hollow Recreation Area annually? Pretty even breakdown here, but notice what I thought was interesting, 25% of the people that responded come to the lake more than 10 times a year. That's pretty active use. And a lot of users between 5 and 10, and then some users under 5 times a year as well. But pretty good distribution, and obviously a key recreation resource for the area. Would you support additional funding to improve water quality at Big Hollow Lake? 75% said yes. 18% said yes, but not if it directly affects my taxes, which is, understandable response. The good news is there are plenty of funding sources that don't directly impact taxes or bottom line. So we want to bring those sources to the table here. Another question regarding Big Hollow Recreation Area, please indicate how important the following issues are to you. I had to doctor this up a little bit, but really what I wanted to point out is anything related to water quality, there are about these first 5 or 6 graphs, the overwhelming majority of people answered very important. Water, very important to me regarding my use of Big Hollow Recreation Area. Canoeing and kayaking and boating, maybe not quite as a popular answer, but still very popular answer. In case you're wondering, the blue bar here is, again, those that answered very important on down to purple was not important at all. Only really 1 or 2 responses that included that at all. Another question posed to the public and lake users. Would you be willing personally to contribute, either financially or through volunteer work and time, to improve water quality at Big Hollow Lake? Check all that apply. 16% said absolutely, almost 17%, I would contribute financially, it's that important to me. 25% said I'd love to volunteer. And another 60% said, yeah, maybe, depending on the project. I think the take home here is, yeah, but I need more information. That's what tonight is all about. So if you've got questions about how you can do that, again, speak to Chris and his team, and we'll get you set up. Now we've shifted the focus of the next few questions here to landowners specifically. First question was to assist us to better understand your point of view. Please indicate which of the following best represents your role within this watershed. 43% said, I own and operate land that is currently involved in agricultural production. Another 35% said, I own land, but it is rented and operated by others. So right there you have the vast majority of the land use in the watershed is either, and the response is either landowners or active landowners that are farming or landowners that are renting to farmers. Another question we asked is, in order to better assist us, to better understand the values and the opinions of those living and working in the watershed, check your level of agreement or disagreement with the following. So blue here, strongly agree. Purple, strongly disagree. Water quality is an important problem. The most popular answer was agree. Water quality affects economics. Again, most agree. A little bit of spread there in the data. Water quality affects quality of life. Look at that. The vast majority of responses there were agree. So you kind of get the sense. I would encourage you to go online. You can see the graphs better. Kind of take a look at what your neighbors have how they've responded, and then please do fill out the surveys for your own as well. One more thing here that definitely jumps out. We asked, do you know or understand or need more information about how to protect soil and water quality? A little bit mixed there. So again, we want to get that information into your hands. The last one here is very encouraging. It is my personal responsibility to help protect water quality. The vast majority of people said yes. So that's a great sign for the momentum that we can get here in the watershed to help the lake out. So with that, I'm going to talk about next steps specifically for the plan and going forward, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So a couple other pieces of information. We are going to be doing some lake sediment sampling. Chad mentioned that when nutrients and sediments come into the lake, a lot of it is deposited at the bottom of the lake, and over time that can become the source in and of itself. That material, under certain conditions, can release phosphorus back up into the water column. So even in theory, if you could turn off the spigot as to what's coming in, if you could turn that off overnight, you've still got a potential source of phosphorus that's already built up in the lake, and that can become available over time. So we want to see what's down there, quantify it, and get a sense of, are we already at the point where that could be a concern, or do we feel like we're quite a few years before we have to get too concerned with that? There are some other interesting things going on in the watershed there with the potential role of gypsum. That's a very, there's a lot of questions around that, so the testing we'll be doing will help answer that question as well. How could that be impacting the sediments down there, both positively and negatively, potentially? We then want to finalize the plan. Again, we're hoping for some feedback from you folks tonight, and develop that plan and schedule. And then we want to take the plan to some of these partner agencies and see what kind of help we can get for the watershed and the lake in terms of outside funding. And then we want to get practices in the ground. And Tyler's really your guy there for that. Talk with Tyler and his colleagues over at Nrcs and the Soil and Water Conservation District. So that's kind of where we're going. And that was a lot. So we will open it up now for questions. And any of us here can jump in.
I had a few things